Thank you all very much for coming. It's very much appreciated. So basically what I'm going to do today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the evolution of this really important day in New Zealand's national calendar. So I'm just going to give a brief little overrun of why we celebrate Anzac on Anzac Day, the 25th. So just the Gallipoli campaign particularly, just briefly. And then I'll talk about the evolution of Anzac Day as a national holiday and then a little bit about it in the context of the museum. But every year on the 25th of April, Anzac Day, New Zealanders and Australians mark the anniversary of the Gallipoli landings in 1915. On that day, thousands of young men, far from their homes, stormed the beaches of the Gallipoli Peninsula in what is now modern Turkey. For 9 long months, New Zealanders, Australians and allies from France and the British Isles and India battled harsh conditions and Turkish opponents who were desperately fighting to protect their homeland. By the time the campaign ended, 120,000 men had died, more than 80,000 Turkish soldiers and 44,000 British and French soldiers, including over 8,500 Australians and 2,000 Indians. Among the dead were 2,721 New Zealanders, about a quarter of those who'd landed on the peninsula. In the history of the Great War, the Gallipoli campaign made no large mark. The number of dead, though horrific, pales in comparison with the number that died in France and in Belgium during the war. But for New Zealand, along with Australia and Turkey, the Gallipoli campaign played an important part in fostering a sense of national identity. I'd like to just quickly read a quote there was someone who was serving in the Gallipoli campaign, Percival Fenwick, who was a medical officer. And this is what he said: We live so much under the shadow of sudden death that one sees things very differently to ordinary times. Life is normally complicated. Here it is savagely simple. Eat while you can, help all you can, sleep when and where you can, and above all, grin and keep a stiff upper lip. Even a mechanical smile is better than an anxious look. Worrying is not good for the men. But I suppose the real question is, why were we in Gallipoli at all? Obviously, New Zealand was part of the British Empire at times, so we went to war there, but what were we doing in Turkey? Within a few months of the outbreak of the First World War in August 1914, a line of trenches stretched from Switzerland to the Belgian coast. The Germans and their Austro-Hungarian allies were on one side of the line, and on the other there were the French and British forces and their allies. Things had reached a stalemate with the Central Powers, Germany and Austro-Hungary, dividing Europe and the allies of Britain and France on one side and the Russians on the other. So here you can see. So at this point, early in 1914, you had a large trench line running basically through this line here, and it essentially cut Europe in two. So the Russian Empire on this side was completely cut off from its allies over here. The British were very keen to find ways to break the German lines, and superior sea power and the attacks they could then make on shipping and supplies seemed to be the answer. Winston Churchill, who was then a cabinet minister, suggested several ways to use British naval resources. One of these was an assault on the Dardanelles, which is this strait here, which I'll show you a bit closer in a moment. He was opposed by the First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, Sir Jack Fisher, but Sir Jack was overruled and they decided to send the men in. So the 50-kilometre long strait, which separates the Aegean Sea from the Sea of Marmara, which is this part here, was at its narrowest point less than 2 kilometres wide. The aim was to pass a force into the Sea of Marmara and threaten Istanbul, which is up the top there, which was the capital of Germany's ally, the Ottoman Empire, which is now modern Turkey. The city guarded the Bosphorus, which is the narrow waterway leading into the Black Sea, and so the city was open to attack from the ocean. Knocking the Ottomans out of the war would allow the British to supply Russia directly by sea, as all land routes to this well-manned but extremely poorly equipped country had been cut off. The straits were heavily defended by mines and artillery, so troops needed to be landed to capture one side of the Dardanelles and allow the British fleet access. So troops, including the Anzac forces, were landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, which you can see here, and the rest is history. So effectively, if we go back a slide, they're coming in from the Aegean on this side here and landing on this side of the water, because on the other side, these little black dots, they're all artillery emplacements all the way across, and here's that 2-kilometre wide piece. These black dots here were minefields. Initially, they tried to force a pass just with the army, and they lost 5 ships struck mines in this area, so they decided they had to withdraw and land. The original landing point was here, and to drive up the coast and knock one whole side of the batteries out, which means the ships could hug the coast through and make it through and attack Istanbul. So that's why we were in that particular part of the world. So, moving on from that, there's lots of excellent literature about the Gallipoli campaign. I'm no expert, so I'm going to move on to Anzac Day itself, but I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea of the context of why this holiday developed. But Anzac Day, as we know it, began to take shape almost as soon as news reached New Zealand of the landing of soldiers on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the 25th of April. Within a few years, core elements of the day were set, and the Anzac story and sacredness of the commemoration was enshrined. So the first public recognition of landings at Gallipoli occurred almost immediately on the 30th of April 1915, after news of the dramatic event had reached New Zealand. A half-day holiday was declared for all government offices, flags were flown and patriotic meetings were held. People eagerly read descriptions of the landings and the casualty lists, even if the latter made for grim reading. Newspapers gushed about the heroism of New Zealand soldiers. From the outset, public perception of the landings evoked national pride. The eventual failure of the Gallipoli operation enhanced its sanctity for many. There may have been no military victory, but there was a victory of the spirit, as New Zealand soldiers showed courage in the face of adversity and sacrifice. New Zealanders soon demanded some form of remembrance on the anniversary of the Gallipoli landings. This became both a means of rallying support for the war effort and a public expression of grief, for there were no bodies brought home. On the 5th of April 1916, a half-day holiday for the 25th of April was gazetted, and here's the original thing from the newspaper by the Prime Minister at the time, Massey, and church services and recruiting meetings were proposed. That's the importance of these memorial days in the Commonwealth tradition, just to do a little sideline, is really very significant because unlike in the American tradition, traditionally in the Commonwealth, they've not brought soldiers home. They're buried in Commonwealth cemeteries overseas. I'm on the New Zealand War Graves Trust, so I know there's 36,000 New Zealanders buried overseas who were served, and most of them are in the Western Front and the great big cemeteries there, but you get things like people coming home on troop ships. So we've got 2 people in Panama who were wounded and died of their wounds on their way home. So they were buried while the ship was stopped in Panama. So there's 2 New Zealand war graves in Panama, for example. So you find them all over the world. So these memorial days became very important for families because it was like being able to go to the funeral of your loved one. Returned servicemen weren't interested in church service and recruiting meetings. They wanted something else. One of them saying, the boys don't want to be split up amongst 20 or 30 different churches on Anzac Day, and it's certain they don't want to go to a meeting to hear people who haven't been there spout and pass resolutions. Instead, returned servicemen preferred a public service conducted by an army chaplain. Returned servicemen soon claimed complete ownership of the day's ceremonies. These included processions of returned and serving personnel, followed by church services and public meetings at town halls. Speeches extolled national unity, imperial loyalty, remembrance of the dead, and the need for young men to volunteer at a time when conscription loomed. The features of Anzac Day evolved during the 1920s and 30s. Public war memorials erected in the 1920s took the place of town halls or churches in the ceremony. In the process, the ceremony itself became less overtly religious. There were occasional protests from churches, but it was RSA leaders, servicemen, and local politicians who increasingly made the speeches rather than clergymen. Gradually, the service became less like a mournful funeral. The laying of wreaths became more central to the ceremony, and there were fewer speeches and hymns. Uniformed members of the armed forces became accepted in many places as participants in the march and in the service. New Zealand's Anzac Day services began to include new features taken appropriately from our Anzac partner, Australia. The Dawn Parade, commemorating both the time of the initial landings at Gallipoli, first thing in the morning, and the routine dawn stand-tos in the trenches, was an Australian idea. It was widely adopted in New Zealand from 1939, although some centres, such as Whanganui, had included dawn parades in their commemorations for several years before this. The cold and darkness breaking into sunrise added to the symbolism of the occasion, and those of you who've been to a dawn service I'm sure will agree. The outbreak of war in 1939 gave a new meaning to Anzac Day. The commemorations predictably focused on the current war. Speeches appealed for the people to follow the Anzac spirit and links between the first Anzacs and women and men serving overseas were stressed. During the 6 years of war, public interest in the day grew, although security concerns meant that large crowds were not encouraged to gather to mark the day during the Second World War. I'm a bit early on that one, but it's all right. The events of the Second World War made Anzac Day a time of commemoration of all the wars in which New Zealanders had taken part. Veterans from both world wars now paraded together. The day became intergenerational. Maori veterans were more in evidence as well from this time. In all, the day seemed to reflect the idea of New Zealand as a united community. Attendance at the ceremonies increased, and 6,000 people attended the dawn service in Auckland in 1957. So I just wanted to copy this fairly dull piece of writing, but it's actually very significant for Anzac Day. So this is the Act of Parliament, or part of the Act of Parliament that defines Anzac Day now, which was passed in 1966 and still applies. And the really significant part is 1, A through E. And the thing I wanted to point out at this point is that Anzac Day, while it takes place on the day of the Gallipoli landings, we commemorate all fallen New Zealand servicemen and women, as it says there. And the ones they enumerate, First and Second Wars, South Africa, Korea, Malaya and Borneo, and Vietnam, and also all of those who at any time have given their lives for New Zealand, the British Empire or the Commonwealth of Nations. So this is really significant because people quite often, and I get the people who think this are the ones who write to me, feel that there's a real focus on the First World War around Anzac Day, and it's always going to be somewhat dominant because it happens on that particular anniversary. But it's really important to remember that the whole basis of it now is to commemorate our fallen men and women, not necessarily just the Gallipoli campaign. Anzac Day was caught up in the protest movements of the 1960s and 70s. This is in Cathedral Square, especially around issues of peace and women's rights. The day had become more than a commemoration of New Zealand war dead and a war service. It was being used to make statements about war and society. Many returned servicemen were puzzled or angry at this, but such activities helped to breathe fresh relevance into the day. Increasingly, Anzac Day was regarded as an appropriate day on which to debate defence and war-related issues. Former servicemen and politicians used the day themselves to speak out on anti-nuclear policy during the 1980s. The 75th anniversary of the Gallipoli landings in 1990 attracted intense interest. This was the year in which New Zealand marked its sesquicentenary, or 150th anniversary of the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi. As a result, many New Zealanders discussed issues surrounding the theme of national identity. An official delegation led by the Governor-General and including a Gallipoli veteran was at an emotional service at Gallipoli on the 25th of April. There was even more interest in the 90th anniversary of the landings. In 2006, thousands of New Zealanders were at Gallipoli. They gathered in the chill evening of the 24th of April, marked the dawn service with the Australians at Anzac Cove, and attended the distinctly New Zealand ceremony at Chunnock Bear later in the day. Politicians, dignitaries and representatives of New Zealand's armed forces were all there. The interest will only continue to grow heading into the 100th anniversaries of the First World War beginning in 2014. So, moving on to Anzac here at the museum. Today, Auckland War Memorial Museum holds the largest Anzac dawn service in the country, despite that there are approximately 60 other Anzac Day services in the Greater Auckland region. Much like the evolution of Anzac Day itself, this has been an evolutionary process and has become a key element of the museum. However, the museum did not start as a war memorial. The museum was founded in 1852 and it later moved to its first purpose-built home in Princes Street in 1876, and that was our home at the time. The Auckland Museum at that point was a general institution of history and culture. The building you see in the slide became inadequate to house the growing collection by the early 20th century, and the idea of a domain location for the new building was floated by 1913. With the outbreak of the First World War, the suggestion was made that the construction of the new museum be integrated with the war memorial, and by 1917 the decision had been made to go ahead with this plan. The museum opened in 1929, having been painstakingly constructed from the finest of materials. The Cenotaph and Court of Honour area were initially a point of contention between the public and the museum authorities, as funds were depleted and a separate subscription of £33,000 had to be raised to complete the area. And that's perhaps the first example of the tensions that sometimes exist between the two dual purposes of the museum, as a museum and as a war memorial. However, the Court of Honour was completed by the early 1930s, And in this photograph, you can see one of the very early Anzac Day services here at the museum. As mentioned earlier, the dawn service had not yet become dominant, and this is the equivalent of what you'd today call the civic service at 11 o'clock. The Anzac services held at the museum remain much the same, with perhaps the biggest change is far fewer veterans who are still with us on these days, whereas of course in the past they were very dominant, as you can see there in the ranks on all sides of the cenotaph. So this picture is far more indicative of what you might see when you come along to the museum for Anzac Day in 2012. The dawn service is by now far and away the most popular. As I mentioned, we host the largest in the country. We generally get around 25,000 attendees. And families now form the largest single group, and the numbers growing year by year. The making of Anzac Day is itself a long and complex process, and then with numerous outside partners. Around November every year, the Auckland Council calls together a committee of which the Royal New Zealand Return and Services Association and the museum are the central players, but including representatives from a broad cross-section of various civic institutions such as police, St John and numerous others. The planning takes place from November of the previous year and goes on right up to Anzac Day and includes discussions on everything from flag protocols to portaloos. In recent years, Maori television has provided excellent coverage throughout the day, including a live broadcast of the dawn service. If we've got everything right, our biggest job on the day should be handing out the orders of service and praying for the rain to hold off for a few more hours, but it's rare that some minor issue that needs dealing with doesn't crop up. For some years, and increasingly, the museum has endeavoured to make Anzac Day bigger than just the two services and puts on a varied and vibrant program of events on and around the 25th of April. Perhaps the highest profile of recent years is the Illuminate Anzac program, which you can see an example of last year's here, where historic footage is projected onto the external facade of the building. The first few years featured the only surviving footage of troops in Gallipoli, which is held by the National War Memorial in Australia and restored by Sir Peter Jackson. For 2011 and 2012, the museum has worked with renowned filmmaker Galen Preston to produce films, last year on women in war and this year focusing on the veteran, and those will be playing on the 21st and 22nd of this month, so Saturday and Sunday, so do come along. On the 25th of April itself, there are numerous activities to take part in to enrich the Anzac experience. Perhaps the best known is the Lest We Forget poetry competition, which is now in its 8th year. This often attracts hundreds of entries, and finalists are invited to read their work in the Hall of Memories on Anzac Day. Over the years, we have many different programs, including actors performing vignettes, film and lecture programs, music, and guided tours of the War Memorial floor, which is a real favourite. However, the museum as a war memorial doesn't just stop on Anzac Day. We host numerous memorial events throughout the year, the most prominent of which is Armistice Day. Armistice Day is a very important day for the museum's calendar, as unlike Anzac, which is done with the council, that's entirely the museum's gig, and we are very proud of it. We host numerous memorial services for various veterans groups. Traditionally, we've always had the US Memorial Day service here. This year will be their 67th year, and there's lots of others as well, lots of one-offs. And this weekend we're hosting the 24th Battalion's Beat Retreat for the wrapping up of their association. So Anzac Day itself, however, is a very special day for the museum. It's both our busiest and most meaningful day, and the one in which we are most connected to the entire country, both those who come here and those who are watching from home. Personally, I've always felt it to be a huge privilege to be so involved in putting it all together, and it seems to be a day where the country as a whole seems to come together as well. Ultimately, it's about our veterans, those who did not return, and those who came back, but whose lives would always be affected by their experiences, as well as coming together nationally to experience a uniquely New Zealand expression of our cultural identity. I'll be there bright and early on Anzac Day morning, and hopefully I'll see all of you there as well. Thank you.